How's it going? Everybody excited? All right, well, I'm going to be talking about the development of Quake for the first time ever at a conference. This is the first time. A lot of people have heard the story of Doom, and no one's heard the story of Quake, so here we go. So Quake was released in 1996, but its story actually starts in 1990. We used to play Dungeons & Dragons in John Carmack's campaign, and there was this group in there called the Silver Shadow Band that did work for a group called Justice. So in the Silver Shadow Band, there was this super badass named Quake that had an incredible Thor-like hammer. He's someone that you would almost never see because he's so high level, and our group was made up of just low-level peons. We're basically lucky to even see him and go on an awesome adventure with him once or twice. So needless to say, we wanted to make a game with Quake in it, especially if we could play as Quake. So we were finishing up our first Keen trilogy, and we decided after Commander Keen, we wanted to make Quake next. So in the preview section of Marooned on Mars, the shareware episode that we put out, we hyped up the idea for our next game, which was called Quake, The Fight for Justice. So we worked on the prototype for a couple of weeks in January 1991, and it just was not what we were thinking. The tech wasn't there yet. So we decided to put it on ice. Someday we will make Quake. So it reminds me of the start of Pixar, how all the ideas for all of their movies came out of one meeting at the very start of that company. So we continued working on Dangerous Dave and the Haunted Mansion to return to Quake later. So we released Wolfenstein 3D, Spear of Destiny, Doom, Doom 2, Heretic, Hexen. Carmack was planning on making his next engine true 3D, thank God. So we decided that it was time to make Quake finally. It was only 4 years after the prototype, but in that time, we had made 15 games, an engine upgrade to Wolfenstein 3D for Raven Software's Shadowcaster. We played around with Atari Lynx development for Wolfenstein 3D, and Atari even wanted us to create their mascot character named Pounce. And we made the Super Nintendo version of Wolfenstein 3D. And this was with a team of only 6 people. The Archvile standing in for Tom Hall, who wasn't there during this picture. So the original ideas behind Quake were starting to develop at the end of 1994. We didn't have a cohesive vision of the game or how it would play. That's a big echo, huh? All right, so we did not immediately assume that it would be a shooter. What we had was the knowledge that we would be creating a true 3D world for gameplay to take place in. So what we had, so we started to form the ideas for this. Our game design ideas began with Quake the character, and he had a huge and powerful hammer. He could throw that hammer and destroy buildings, at least in the D&D universe. Quake came from a medieval time period, so we already knew that the game would take place in the past. We talked about how the camera could move. One incredible scene would be possible is that you could sneak up behind someone in multiplayer mode who's standing at the edge of a hill and basically just slam their head in with a hammer right in the back of their skull, and they would tumble down the mountain and see the world rotate forwards as opposed to the left and right rotation that players are used to with the mouse. We never got that working, but the idea was there just in case we wanted to have that kind of gameplay. The first part of starting work on the engine was establishing the priorities. A client-server architecture was just as important as the engine being true 3D. So we were not going to be faking it like the Doom-era technology. This time it was going to be real, and it had to be real fast. To do that, we were going to be using the FPU for the first time to speed up 3D calculations, since most processors at that time had them built in. We were developing on Intel Pentium chips around 90 megahertz, with 8 megabytes of RAM. We were still targeting DOS as the gaming operating system to play it on. And we were developing the game on the Next Step workstation. Before making levels, we needed a level editor that could create 3D maps. And before we could write a 3D level editor, we needed to define the structure of the world and how it would be represented. So this was John Carmack's new engine design, and it was going to be based on an element that he called brushes. A brush could be any shape, but in the editor, it would start as a rectangular volume. Special cutting tools could shave off edges so slopes could be made, but those tools cut at an infinite distance. So creating interesting shapes required several brushes individually sliced and pieced together. An example of this is the first door you see when you come down the ramp from the initial slipgate. It's a high-tech door that has a notch on one side and the other side has a bump on it, and they fit perfectly together. To create this door required 3 pieces on one side and 2 pieces on the other side. So the editor was called Quake, and it had a unique way of making levels, because creating a true 3D editor would be like creating today's Maya or 3D Studio Max from scratch, and it would take a long time. So we went with a very simplistic editor that showed levels from the top down and a side view that showed the brushes that were under a special marker, like an X, that we placed whenever we wanted to adjust the vertical height of brushes. So we could drag the brushes in the view up and down and see the result in a small 3D rendered view in the top left corner. So because of this way of viewing and creating levels, it took more work to make simple things like a ramp, like the ramp you walk down when you come through the slipgate. You may be thinking that this way of editing levels would be incredibly difficult and insane, and you'd be right. For example, that base door that I drew, for the base door, I drew it in 2D, and then I had to rotate it so then it was vertical. Then I could rotate it and move it into place using the side view and the marker. That's for every single thing. This process happened for every single brush in every level. It was extremely labor-intensive, but the team was making levels instead of waiting for some giant 3D level design tool to be created. So here's some sketches I made before starting on the first Quake map, which was E1M1. In the final map, the first map basically had that shape, the golden horseshoe. You start at one side and go around like this and finish it. At this time, it was early 1995, and a whole lot of stuff was happening. Doom and Doom 2 were out in the world and had changed gaming. Dealing with that involved an incredible amount of talking to journalists because everyone wanted to know how we did it and who we were. So it was important to keep John Carmack coding and away from press interviews. So Jay Wilbur and I handled those duties. John knew that he was going to need some more programming firepower. At this bleeding edge of technology, we could only work with the best. So the first obvious person that entered our minds was Michael Abrash. After all, he was the genius that wrote Power Graphics Programming, the book that John learned from that gave him all the graphics knowledge he needed to develop our first Commander Keen engine in 1990, the game that helped make the PC into a real gaming platform. Michael was a programming legend. He had written for Dr. Dobbs' journal for years, teaching the intricacies of 8086 assembly language, the way Roger Wagner taught 6502 assembly in the pages of Soft Talk magazine 10 years earlier. Michael was a hero programmer, and John needed a hero who could write assembly language fast and great. So John flew to Seattle to convince Michael that Quake's technology would be the first steps toward the metaverse that Neil Stephenson describes in his book, Snow Crash. This was something that John knew Michael was very interested in doing. So it didn't take much more pushing from John to get Michael to leave Microsoft and move to Texas. So the first half of 1995 was very busy with bringing Michael Abrash into id Software, my coding of Quake Ed to get Sandy Peterson and American McGee learning how to make levels in 3D, getting Hexen underway with Raven Software, working on the Ultimate Doom, making levels for that and putting it together. It was the first retail version of Doom that people could actually walk into a store and buy. And then I had to spend a lot of time experimenting with true 3D level creation in Quake Ed. There was a lot of stuff going on. During the first 4 months, the engine was working with a client-server architecture, and we made some test levels so we could move them around in multiplayer, or so we could move around in them in multiplayer. Since we hadn't established how we were even going to be building models yet, we used Golden Sphere 2D Sprite. So after a short time of researching methods for making 3D models with animation and hardware that could do it quickly and easily, John decided on a path in reading file formats and UV mapping skin textures. We bought a Silicon Graphics Indigo 2 workstation and Alias modeling software. Kevin Cloud decided he was going to be the guy making all of Quake's 3D models. Adrian would do the textures and everything else that was 2D. Kevin made the player model first so we could stop moving around as spheres. The skin textures were a little tricky because they were limited in total coverage, so Kevin had to model in a certain way. American was busy making a ton of small maps for John's engine to render. The engine was going through a lot of changes, mainly architectural in the renderer for speed's sake. American made around 50 small maps for John, stressing different areas of the renderer. These were all throwaway maps. At the same time, he was working on actual levels for the game that he hoped would be able to be included. So rewritten algorithms for caching light map rendered textures meant Abrash had to rewrite his tightly written assembly loops over and over. By the end of the engine's development, there were 8 major engine render architecture changes that required rewriting. So let me take this time to also say that Quake's renderer was written before the existence of GPUs. That means that every single pixel on the screen was computed with perspective-correct texture mapping in assembly language and placed on the VGA screen, which had a limit of 256 colors. The screen is at a 4:3 ratio because no one had 16:9 monitors, since there were no video resolutions that supported that. Quake was usually run in 320x200 pixel mode. This is an early screenshot of Quake before we even created the status bar. So halfway through 1995, we didn't have a solid game design because the engine kept going through changes, and we still had no additional coders that could write gameplay code to test our early ideas. So work kept going on models, textures, levels, and technology. We knew that whatever we created would be usable in any design that we settled on. Hexen launched on October 30th, Devil's Night, during the huge Dwango Deathmatch 95 event held at Microsoft's campus in Seattle. I was at the office in Texas to play Deathmatch over the modem with the winner of the Doom 95 tournament that took place. The winner was Dennis Fong, also known as Thresh. The twist was that we had the Deathmatch in Hexen, which I had been playing a lot of, and which he played for the first time that night. So work continued for another few weeks until the engine was finally considered done enough to make the game. So now we would have programmer time dedicated to gameplay programming. We decided to have a company-wide meeting to determine which direction we would go in. The team was burnt out. We'd been working away trying to make a game without gameplay programming or an idea of how fast the engine would go eventually. The speed of that engine would help determine the kind of game that we would make. A slower engine would be able to create the game design that we had at the start of the project, and a fast engine could be used for an FPS. So I wanted to experiment with game design and see what we could do with this new 3D fast engine, and I was not as interested in making another FPS as I was about exploring our possibility space. Half the team, made up of the members who were burnt out, wanted to just slap some FPS guns in it and finish the levels and ship it. The other half were okay with trying to do some design experimentation. At that point, if you're working with a team in that state, the only way forward is to do the easiest thing. So we decided that Quake would be an FPS. We would start working in a common room and get the game done as fast as possible. Then I decided that my time in id would be done after shipping Quake. We had just taken over the rest of the 6th floor at Town East Tower. The offices that we just got were demolished, all the walls, everything. So we picked this huge corner space as our war room that we would use to finish Quake. We all moved our computers and belongings into it. Around this time, we found out that Nine Inch Nails were huge fans of Doom, and they played on their tour bus very often. So we got in touch with Trent Reznor, and we talked about him doing the soundtrack for Quake. So he came to our office, we talked about it, we decided that it would be an ambient soundtrack and not songs like all of our previous games. In the meantime, Trent got us some ambient music that a friend of his made to kind of hold us over while we were waiting for him to finish Quake's soundtrack. So my first task was to redesign the game so it used all currently created levels, added some interesting story and creature designs that emphasized the Lovecraftian influence of our environment and story. So I added several enslaved old ones, various keys in different dimensions that you needed to travel to so you could free them, and a little bit more complexity. After talking with Kevin and Adrian about how many models, animations, and textures that they could do, I had to simplify the design into a game that we could finish quickly. So I took a lot of those keys and characters out, and I streamlined the design back to more of a simpler get key, open door, kill monsters, find secrets, find the exit stuff that we all know so well. So the newest stuff in this game was inherent in the engine technology, such as the way that secret doors open by moving back and then sliding sideways. Doors can open horizontally finally in Quake. And we finally had platforms that could follow a path and take the player on a ride. We had water that you could swim in, and you could hear the surface of the water and the wind blowing outside. We added wind tunnels that could propel the player through the air, and we could even change gravity and let the player float. We used the special properties of the engine to make the levels more dynamic than Doom. And it resulted in a very scary single-player campaign mode. So this was January 1996, and the mood in the war room was not a good one. People didn't talk to each other much, and the atmosphere was oppressive. The room was mostly silent, where in years past we'd share music played on a boombox. We just had to get the game done, so we entered crunch mode. This was 7 days a week until we shipped. So I called Tom Hall, my id co-founder who left halfway through Doom, if he would be interested in co-founding a new company after Quake shipped. Tom was working on his latest game, Prey, and said that he would love to start a new company. So plans for Ion Storm lay dormant until after Quake's release. Around the end of February, we got the game ready to test multiplayer mode with a few deathmatch maps. In fact, we decided that we wanted all players to test the game for us. So we called this build Q-Test, and it took us 38 hours nonstop to get it ready. We uploaded it to an FTP site on February 24th, 1996, and we watched the internet reaction. A couple of days later, we called 7 of the most hardcore local Doomers to our office so we could watch them play. They loved it, and their feedback helped us refine some movement and level issues. So the time after Q-Test was kind of a blur. We were working away every day. We got an offer to buy id Software from our publisher, GT Interactive, for $100 million. We were so deep in Quake that we just said we can't even think about it right now. We were not in the right frame of mind. What just happened? Oh, sorry. I think I got my finger too close to this escape key. So on we continued crunching, making more levels, more monsters, more sounds, checking off the design checkboxes. To keep the game at a reasonable size, we had to impose a limitation. We decided that a level's BSP size could not be bigger than 1.4 megabytes, which is basically the size of a 3.5-inch disk. With this restriction, we couldn't make really huge, long levels. I remember working on a really cool entrance for E2M6, and after the level was built, and I went over 1.4 megabytes, unfortunately. So I just deleted it, and I just left the level the way it was. It was just no use arguing at this point. We all just wanted the game done. Eventually, I released the bigger version of this level to the internet about 10 years afterwards. We were getting close to finishing the levels, and everyone on the team could feel that the end was near. The crunch was so intense that American McGee was sick for the entire last month of the game's development. We didn't see him for a couple weeks even after we released the game. Other team members pitched in to finish his levels so that we could ship. I finished the sound work. We finally got the tracks from 9 Inch Nails. And a horrible decision from the record company was that the music could not be in MP3 form. So the music had to be as CD audio tracks burned onto the CD and playable only from CD. And this is the reason why none of the music played while people played the game. They installed the game, took the CD out, and they basically only to hear the music, they would have to leave the CD in the player all the time. So on the day of release, I don't even remember how we decided the day that Quake was ready to go out. It was Saturday, June 22nd of 1996. And as I had done for every single id Software game since the beginning, I created the demos that you see in attract mode, and I created the Gold Masters. So no one was at the office. The company was basically broken. It took me several hours to get the game in a final state because it was the first game that we made that had subdirectories. And finding a compression that was not zip at the time and handled subdirectories was difficult. So I settled on the LHA compressor, and it took a while to finally get it to work correctly. And I wanted someone else to be at the office there for the upload, so I called my friend Mark Fletcher, who was a really hardcore doomer. So I was on IRC making sure that everyone knew that the upload was imminent. IRC was exploding and splitting constantly due to too many people being in the channel. I uploaded quake.zip, and I hung out to hear the fans' reactions. And then Mark and I left. So the next month was a pretty slow one. People were recuperating. American finally came back. I took a 2-week vacation, and I came back to create the retail Quake Gold Masters for physical distribution. Right after that, on August 6th, John Carmack wanted me out of the company, and I wanted to start Ion Storm with Tom, so everything worked out. Within 6 months, half of id Software's 13 employees left the company, and Quake had taken its toll. But of course, that was not the end. id Software went on to create the incredible Quake 2. And I was busy heading up Ion Storm while we worked on 4 games at once: Anachronox, Dominion, Daikatana, and Deus Ex. We all still continue to create games to this day with the exception of John. He's dedicated to VR, and Abrash is there to help him. And Kevin is still at id Software, and Tom is at Play First in San Francisco, and I'm at Romero Games in Galway, Ireland, where life is good. Thank you very much.